Welcome to the 6th episode of our webinar series where we discuss ESI, Entrepreneurship, Startups and Innovation, and how these contribute to shape the post-pandemic recovery. I am Julia Marsan, Area Director for Strategy and Partnership, and I'm here together with TJ Oy from Curated Connectors, a company based in Singapore, and also Lina Maulidina from ERIA to co-host this webinar series. And today we will be discussing about incubators and accelerators. These organizations are actively supporting new firms, startups, to grow and scale up in different countries. So we continue our conversation about innovation ecosystems across the region, and we will be doing that with amazing speakers from very different places, from Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, and Cambodia. TJ will introduce in a minute in detail all speakers, but before that, let me just remind you that once again, you will find in the chat box some links to some of our publications and other knowledge products related to the topic of conversation today. So keep an eye also to the chat box to get our resources. And also, another reminder, in case you missed some of our previous episodes, all recordings are now available on our ERIA YouTube channels. Feel free to go and have a look. And we're also preparing a short policy brief with the key messages arising from the first half of the series, that is episodes 1 to 5. We are now today starting actually the second half of the series. And we hope we'll be able to share with you all this document very soon. But now it's almost time to start the real conversation. So let me remind you to please keep your microphone on mute throughout the entire duration of the webinar. But I was referring to the chat box before, so please feel free to use it to interact with us and the speakers and to ask them questions, because we will get back to your questions during the Q&A part of the webinar towards the end. So I think that's all for me for now. I'm handing it over to TJ to start introducing speakers, and thank you so much for connecting with us today. Over to you, TJ.
Thank you very much, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is TJ from Curated Connectors in Singapore. I'll be the main moderator for this afternoon's session. And let me first introduce our distinguished speakers for this afternoon. First we have Mr. Brian Cole, who is Director, Ecosystem Development and Digital Infrastructure at NUS Enterprise, a department of the National University of Singapore. He oversees ecosystem development, digital infrastructure, and corporate partnerships. Brian has been involved in building up the ecosystems to support startups and entrepreneurs both on and off campus, establishing infrastructure, programs, and networking for the global ecosystem. These include building up Block 71, which is an iconic entrepreneurial space situated in the JTC Launchpad area in Singapore. He also continues to oversee the development of innovation and enterprise initiatives covering sectors such as maritime, cybersecurity, agri-tech, aqua-tech, and food tech. Prior to NUS, Brian, together with some friends, built a startup company to eventually become publicly listed on the main board of the Singapore Stock Exchange. In Adroit Innovations, he headed and led the Malaysia operations, sales and marketing, and general management activities, building a profitable market presence for this regional subsidiary. So welcome, Brian, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, TJ.
Our next speaker is Ms. Jane Chan. Jane is head of Start Me Up HK at Invest HK, the government department responsible for attracting and retaining foreign direct investment into Hong Kong. Start Me Up HK is the startup division, which was established in 2014 with the aim to attract innovative startups, investors, and other stakeholders to Hong Kong, positioning it as a premier startup destination. It provides a one-stop service platform to support these companies setting up, building ecosystem, with really the aim of transforming the city to become a global hub for innovation and entrepreneurship. Prior to joining Invest HK, Jane was Executive Director at TIE. You may know them as the Indus Entrepreneurs, a global nonprofit network focused on fostering entrepreneurship and management roles as well in advertising and digital agencies. She's been involved as a startup at Investor, Incubator, consulting, not just for startups, but also for manufacturing companies. So welcome, Jane. Thank you for joining us as well this afternoon. Our third speaker is Mr. Seah Hui Ang. He is Professor of International Business and Strategy and the Chair in Business in Asia at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He is also the Director of New Zealand's Southeast Asia Centre of Asia Pacific Excellence. In these roles, Seah Hui works with various stakeholders and companies on their strategies in Asia and Asia's engagement in New Zealand. Seah Hui's research centers around the connection between international business and international trade. He writes frequently in the media, and his works have been published in international top-tier journals. He is also senior editor at the Journal of World Business and has sat on national assessment panels for various scholarships and funds in New Zealand. He has also won several research rewards. Before joining Victoria University of Wellington, Seah Hui was Professor and Associate Dean at the University of Auckland Business School. He has also work experiences in City University in London, as well as National University of Singapore. And right now, he is also a visiting professor to quite a number of Asian universities. So, we are really glad to have you join us this afternoon, Seah Hui. And finally, our fourth speaker for this afternoon is Ms. Cheryl Ng. She is the Startup Ecosystem Support Consultant for UNDP in Cambodia. Cheryl is known for her passionate entrepreneurial spirit to create better and equal economic development opportunities, strengthening local communities and startup ecosystems, as well as supporting young entrepreneurs. Her working experiences has led her from an MNC to international and local social enterprises, and now international development. She co-founded Gen I, a social innovation community, resource hub, and mentorship network based in Toronto. In Cambodia, she has led the design and execution of the first pilot incubation program called Blue Tribe, which launched during the COVID-19 pandemic under UNDP Cambodia. This program aims to help incubate young entrepreneurs and their startups within 6 months in partnership with private sector, local government entities, and international organizations in Southeast Asia. So Cheryl is currently undertaking research to try to put together a guidebook for ecosystem support organizations on what existing model of activities are in Cambodia, what has worked, what has not worked for specific demographics or startup stage, and to help organizations better measure their success indicators. So thank you for joining us, Cheryl. That is a brief introduction to our four speakers. They will try to engage with you as well through the course of this afternoon's session. Now, let me quickly get into the thick of things and to start the ball rolling. So, for the first question for this afternoon, I'd like to just, throw it out to Brian. Brian, being the entrepreneurial arm of NUS, which is a university in Singapore, how have the students benefited from NUS Enterprise, and how has it positioned them for the future?
TJ, thank you so much for allowing me to be here, Julia as well. And thank you for having the rest of the panel here this afternoon. Let me start off by telling you a little bit about NUS Enterprise, which is quite a unique setup for a university. Before I get into some of the programs that our students are enjoying. What is unique about this, and maybe I should start off, as a university, our main core approach to helping innovation and entrepreneurship is still in the education space. So as an academic unit, or sometimes termed as an institute of higher learning, that will be our primary purpose. And therefore, what can we do to help them? NUS Enterprise, as TJ has mentioned earlier, is the entrepreneurial arm of the university. So anything to do with innovation and entrepreneurship, that's where we form. And there are three things that we look into. First of all, we support the whole education part of innovation and entrepreneurship. I'll get into a bit of the program a little later as I explain some of them. Secondly, we look into venture creation. Here we support two levels of venture creation. First of all, in the innovation space, as a university, we produce through our intensive research and development support and many of the research centers that we are involved in, inventions and IP is formed. So the first thing that the unit does, which is to protect intellectual property, often called the Tech Transfer Office, will then make sure that we patent the inventions, and then how do we commercialize it? So commercialization then takes place in two ways. One is it can be pushed out to corporates to be taken off as a license agreement, or what we have been pushing greatly in the last 2 years is to spin off companies, meaning to have startups taking up the technologies. And usually we encourage the postdocs and the research assistants to take their technology out, and we put all the policies and programs in place. We do have a program called the GRIP, which is a Graduate Research Innovation Program, of which we launched about 2 years ago. So in this short span of 2 years, we have produced more than 80 companies in this area itself. And then the last area, as we begin to build startup companies, we need to support them. And therefore, we do have a global platform that supports this whole I&E space through a gateway called Block 71. So Block 71 is a platform in which we have outpost setups, particularly in China, in the US, and then 3 in Indonesia. Last year, we launched Vietnam and Japan itself. And we'll continue to build this up so that our startups can move into all these locations easily as they expand out. After all, Singapore is such a small market, as you know. Now, coming back to the question that TJ has asked me, how would the NUS students actually benefit from the programs that we have? One of the flagship programs that we have is the NUS Overseas Colleges. Now, this was launched many years ago, almost 20 years right now. And we have seen close to almost 3,000 students, alumni coming into this program. What is NUS Overseas Colleges? It's a program whereby, first of all, we start out by ensuring that we select the right students. And so we have a very rigorous way of selection. Students are asked, and we go through several interviews before they are selected into the program. So to just give you an idea, for every 5 applicants, only 1 gets into the program itself. What is this program all about? They spend 1 year in the technological hubs around the world, and we have 10 in the world: Silicon Valley, Israel, New York, Canada, China, and so on and so forth. So all these technological hubs, they spend a year sitting in a startup company alongside with the CEO, the CTO or CMO, learning about a startup. And many of them come back very different in that sense, because they learn to see what a startup environment is all about. In fact, one of the things that we found, having run this program for a few years, that there's a higher propensity for these students to have a startup of their own. We have actually seen more than 600 startups coming out of this program for the students who are of the alumni in this program itself. And some of them have gone on to become unicorns as well for Singapore. So that's one of the programs that we have in place. Some of the other programs are like the summer program that we run for, where we work with our ASEAN countries and the universities, and we encourage students to come into this program. They spend about 3 weeks here. Of course, COVID has limited this, and we've only been able to do this virtually. But in a short 3 weeks, they actually see and develop a business program. And then what's important is interacting with other entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs within the location itself. And then finally, we launched a program last year, the Masters of Venture Creation. And this is really to push the entrepreneur who wants to explore and understand what it takes to build a company through this Master of Venture Creation. So that gives you a bit of a broad overview of what NUS Enterprise does. There are many more things that we do, and I'll probably find the opportunity to fill you in this whole panel itself. But TJ, thank you very much, and I'll hand the session back to you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Brian. For our participants, we have requested for also our speakers that if they have any information and resources that they want to share, that they can do so through the chat box. So we will also encourage our participants to feel free to use the chat box, to post your questions as well as to look at the resources that are available. Now, from Southeast Asia, Singapore, let me move a bit further up north to Hong Kong, where let's talk with Jane. So Jane, in Hong Kong, right, besides, I guess, the fintech companies that would traditionally be interested in the country, could you share with us some of the emerging sectors where startups have also, established their presence in Hong Kong in recent years? Jane, over to you.
Thank you. And I would like to echo Brian's comments. Thank you ever so much, TJ and ERIA, for inviting me to speak here. It's a real pleasure to be, talking with all of you. Just to set some context as well. So Invest Hong Kong is a government department helping overseas companies to establish in Hong Kong as an inward FDI agency. Our team specifically looks after the startup sector. So when we're talking about the startup sector, we're talking about the startups themselves, obviously, but we're talking about the investors, the corporate innovation labs, the corporate venturing arms, all these different kind of stakeholders that make up an ecosystem. We support them and then provide them with information, connections, just whatever they really need to establish on the ground easily. The two other hats that we also wear is to help promote Hong Kong as a international tech hub. And finally, the third thing what we do is to try and build a strong ecosystem here in Hong Kong for tech and innovation to thrive. Now, as part of that task in terms of just trying to understand the ecosystem, how can we support it without knowing what that ecosystem is? We have been tracking the development of the ecosystem over the past 7 years, actually 6 or 7 years. We do a survey for Hong Kong, and it's probably, every time you read about specific startup numbers, it probably comes from our department, actually. So if we look at what's actually the kind of sectors that do well here, obviously fintech is a no-brainer. It's it does take up the largest percentage of the number of startups that we do have in Hong Kong, unsurprisingly, just because we are one of the world's financial centers. There's a lot of talent here, but there are other areas that resonate. And actually, if you dig a little bit deeper into Hong Kong, it's actually the startup industries actually quite closely correlate with the different types of industries that's also in place in Hong Kong, which is actually quite diverse. People always think of us as like finance, like property, or trading. It's a lot more than that. But the areas that we've been seeing doing quite well over the past few years is like the second biggest group out of maybe about 3,300 kind of startups we've got residing in cohort spaces, accelerators and incubators. We've got a substantial portion of that is actually on the e-commerce side, either the e-commerce / logistics, supply chain management, that kind of side. And I think, again, that is actually quite a natural area for Hong Kong to go into, because we are next door to mainland China, which is the biggest e-commerce market in the world. And subsequently, companies looking to potentially sell to that, that new growing middle class that's happening on the mainland, they tend to set up their operations here first, and then they actually go into, the different locations within mainland China, usually to deal with all the logistics side of things. So, we're seeing a lot of international brands coming into Hong Kong to actually try and target this kind of market. But we also get the reciprocal kind of direction as well. We've got a lot of companies, obviously mainland China sells and produces so many kind of products that's being used globally. For the companies that really are looking to basically sell to a bigger international market, they do again set something up here before they actually do that. And the reasons are numerous. It's the fact that we are the only, actually one of two special administrative regions within the whole of China to have a common law system, as opposed to a civil law system that runs in the rest of mainland China. So people are just familiar with the legal aspect of it here, as they would probably in other places in Europe and other locations. It's inherently something they're, comfortable with. If not, hopefully they're not too familiar with the legal aspects, but something that they're really, familiar with. And I think when you're a business looking to expand to a new market, that is one of the aspects you look at. How safe is my business going to be? Am I protected? Is my IP protected? So these are the kind of reasons that people set up here. So the e-commerce and logistics tech, again, established to try and support partly this ecosystem, this flow of like goods across borders, leveraging Hong Kong as the connection point for that. So you've got shipping companies, logistics companies doing this kind of thing. You've got e-commerce return companies that's also managing this, and then you've got the warehousing kind of AI robotics kind of side as well, supporting all of that. So you get kind of spin-off industries that happen within that. The other area we're starting to see quite a lot of traction is also on the prop tech side. So the property tech, another big catch-all kind of title. It's very much composed of lots of different kind of technologies, some of which you may already be hugely familiar with. You've had the lighting systems, aircon controls, remote kind of sensors and all of that. We've been seeing some of that, but the difference in recent actually year and a half max is that the property developers are getting into it. I think prior to this, it was a case of just individuals selling direct to consumers. But now, because Hong Kong has a lot of very large property companies, conglomerates, and now they're starting to deploy, these kind of technologies in their buildings and their homes that they're looking to sell across the gamut of the whole property kind of services. So we're talking about even from, the initial customers trying to find out more about the property, to the actual controls within, trying to reduce your electricity use, all these kind of things. We're starting to see quite a lot of kind of resonance in that. And the other thing I wanted to mention about in terms of different types of industries is that Hong Kong, since January this year, Hong Kong startups have raised $1.7 billion in the first half of this year. We are one of those financial kind of fundraising kind of centers for a lot of startups as well. And if we look into the kind of areas where the biggest funding are going into, I mean, admittedly, a lot of them are actually going into very well established companies anyway, but the areas that we're also seeing where these investments are being made is across, things like travel tech, for example. We've got enterprise software, we've got logistics, blockchain, decentralized financing, all these kind of things. So lots of exciting things happening, and I think there's actually a lot more opportunity within different industries than people potentially think. But yeah, I'll pass it back to you. Thanks, TJ.
Thank you so much, Jane, for giving us really that very flavorful overview of how things are in Hong Kong right now. Exciting, definitely sounds exciting. I will now move back down south to New Zealand and to Xiahui. Can you share with us, perhaps give us an introduction to your center, the Southeast Asia Center of Asia Pacific Excellence? I believe it is also known as SEACAP. And I think more importantly, how it supports entrepreneurship in New Zealand. Xiahui, the floor is yours.
Thanks, TJ. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, okay. Thanks, DJ, and thanks, Julia and Lena, for setting this up and inviting me to this one of these sessions. Now, I'll make it quick, right? So one of the reasons, probably the key reasons for the establishment of the Southeast Asia Center of Asia Pacific Excellence is quite a mouthful, and I'm one of the few people who can actually pronounce this as if they are quite fluent. Even my staff can't do it that way. Now, one of the reasons for that is because the university system, for whatever reasons, has been challenged for many years in New Zealand, especially in the last 5 or 10 years thereabouts, right? So the reason is because we are producing, say, for example, graduates that can't find a job, right? Graduates that doesn't think about reality, right? So probably you can blame the academics for doing that, like teaching theories, teaching too much textbook stuff, and going back to history too long that you don't even look forward when you educate the new generation. So the university system has been challenged, and so. But then the university incentive system also doesn't allow the academics to do a lot of engagement because you know it's not incentivized to do that, right? I think some of you are from the universities, you can resonate with that. So you're asked to do research 40%, perhaps teaching 40%, and then do administration like I used to do, associate deans and whatever, chopping away permissions to do certain things. So academics don't do that, and then the education system fails. So the last government, the national government set up this system. They call it the CAPES, right? The CAPES Center of Asia Pacific Excellence is almost like an engagement system. So what I find myself when I get asked to run this Southeast Asia CAPE is the fact that I get dissected into half, right? So it's like if you say, for example, if you live in New Zealand, there's always not enough people, right? The same can be said of Singapore, of course, for those of you who are living there in Singapore. But at the same time, which means that half of me is that professor and chair. The other half of me is almost like an administrator and a director of a center. Right. So I say, when you talk to me, I don't know which half you're talking to, but never mind, it doesn't matter. It's the same guy. So my left hand needs to talk to my right hand, but the center, what does the center do, right? So as I alluded to that, the misconnection between the education system and the real reality, right? So there are two things that the function of the SEACAP. Now, one of them is to try to bring the academic knowledge into the industry. So in other words, if you're an industry person, you come to the university, normally you knock on the door and say, can I get some help? And then you say, okay, how much money are you willing to pay, right? You can come to my course, but you pay this much money. So a lot of SMEs doesn't have that money. So the government says, okay, we need to have a system to allow the knowledge to be translated or to be transferred across. So they set up this for that one main reason. Now, the second reason for it, as I see it at least, right, is the fact that if we talk about business, then we are also talking about SMEs need help and who can they employ? If you cannot employ young educated, not just young educated, but also at the same time very highly skilled, for the market, right? Digital world, whatever world that we are talking about these days, then basically you're not helping them. So we try in SEACAP, we try to run activities that allow them, train them enough to be able to help businesses in our partnerships with businesses. So I partner, say, for example, with a lot of businesses, including those that are so-called businesses that are run by Maori descendant. Okay, so we do projects around, say, for example, food and nutrition space in the Southeast Asia zone. So there's a lot of these ideas about, how to New Zealand with a limited capacity of everything sells to Southeast Asia. So we do a lot of activities around this kind of engagement. We also do quite a lot of activities around digital and creative industries as well. Now, so for that reason, we support entrepreneurship, we support education, and in many ways, we also try to tie up the entrepreneurship with the markets. In other words, because of my head as the Southeast Asia director, I can't just say, look, guys, let's have some entrepreneurship and innovation, and regardless of which market you are going to sell, it doesn't matter, right? So where my remit sits, then we are looking for opportunities into the ASEAN region, right? To look into what are the opportunities for New Zealand entrepreneurship into the ASEAN region, and so we support that through a lot of activities around business engagement. In other words, for example, I just came back from a session which is why I'm still properly dressed from another event, whereby we actually host an event around digital and creative sectors opportunities in ASEAN. So in that, I have two speakers, two guest speakers. For example, one that has, there is a CEO of a studio, and then the other person is actually an ex-New Zealand Trade Enterprise Trade Commissioner, to share some knowledge to not just students, actually to also the industry about how Southeast Asia might play for the digital world. So we do quite a lot of tertiary things, but at the same time, we encourage them not just being good future employees, but also when they set up their companies, we do a lot of company visits to which they have to craft ideas to potential companies. So in this case, the projects that I'm doing with the digital world is around, sort of getting some potential internships into the Netflix or the Facebook or the Google, and some of them are actually stationed in Southeast Asia as well. So I think that's a quick one to respond to your question, TJ.
Thanks very much, Xiaohui, for introducing us to your center and what's happening really in New Zealand. From the developed nations, I would now like to shift the focus over to one of the growing developing countries in ASEAN. It's a country I'm personally interested in, Cambodia. So, to Cheryl, the Cambodian economy has been growing steadily over the last decade. And with the government's push towards digital transformation and Industry 4.0, could you share with us whether incubators and accelerators in Cambodia have blossomed as well over this last few years? Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, TJ and Julia and the team at ERIA for having me. I think, TJ, when you were describing, just for a little bit of a background, TJ, when you talked about what was in my bio, you were very great at introducing and kind of upping what I'm working on. But essentially in Cambodia, I work under UNDP Cambodia and under the Youth Employment Project. So just a little bit of a background on the project. One of the outputs is to scale entrepreneurship training in the country amongst youth, which actually make up 2/3 of the population in Cambodia. So actually, just to talk a little bit about the context. So I've only been here, I think, since the end of 2019. And since just in 2 years, almost 2 years, it's the ecosystem in terms of programs and activities have grown quite rapidly. And I think it just shows in terms of the GDP growth rate in the past steadily, it's been growing for about 7%. And so when we're looking at what was happening in terms of programs and activities, when I first came in, there weren't a lot of known programs offered. And so even in 2014, I think actively there was only 50 tech startups in the ecosystem. And there was a lot of events and competition. So I think some of you have heard of Startup Weekend and also Bar Camp as well. So they were very focused on competitions and events and hackathons, really to get entrepreneurs or people that are interested in starting businesses to come out into, I guess, building this ecosystem. We're quite very early. I was just listening to all of the other speakers and the progress that you're making and the work that you're doing. We are still quite early, but I think in the past 2 years, I like to think a bit in different stages. So here we have a lot of pre-incubation programs. So a lot around ideation, a lot around building your MVP, building a business model, and really teaching the fundamentals of I guess just understanding a little bit more about building your business model and projecting your cash flow to be ready to present in front of investors if that's even needed. And then there's the incubation phase, where incubation phase could be those that have an MVP and those that are maybe in early operations about 6 months or so and ready to test with more customers and scale their businesses. So I think in the past 2 years I've been here, I've seen that shift of ideation programs and all of these startup competitions to now focusing on actually upskilling some of the entrepreneurs, particularly around building their financial acumen and really understanding how they're making money out of what they're working on. I think in Cambodia, it's really interesting compared to other countries that I've seen, and is because they're so passionate about solving a particular problem, a development problem. But sometimes that passion comes to like, hey, I have an idea to do this, but they don't know exactly how to turn it into or where they're going to generate revenue. So it's really interesting to see how much passion and all these ideas are coming out in the past couple of years. And in terms of support for them, we're seeing, let's say 500 startups came in just this year in terms of the program side. So they haven't come in their investment arm because I think they're still trying to see what the ecosystem is like in Cambodia. And so when we were designing our incubation program, we reached out to 500 when they weren't here yet in the early 2020. And we said, hey, we want to learn a little bit more about how you configure your programs. And we were reaching out to Antler and all these other incubator and accelerator programs. And they said, frankly, look, we're actually partnering with the same government agency as you, NUS Enterprise, which actually just came out with an entrepreneurship development fund in 2019 and just launched and now is co-investing in partnerships with other stakeholders in the entrepreneurship ecosystem in 2020. So all of this is quite new in terms of the ministry getting involved with the entrepreneurship ecosystem. They're under the Ministry of Economy and Finance. We see the Ministry of Post and Telecommunications as well, that has an education institution. And so the story with 500 startups is saying that they are designing something similar as to what we were designing, but because of COVID, they had to push it further away. And so we're seeing the ecosystem just in the past year during the pandemic, ironically enough, actually grow in terms of programs, which I think is really insightful to see that Cambodia is able to still progress in terms of all of these activities and support, even throughout the pandemic. And so that is just what's happened so far in the past 2 years. But I think at the end of the day, we're seeing a lot more programs catered towards still youth. And a lot of the funding that's happening is through international aid funding that then goes into NGOs, and NGOs are the ones running this program. And what we're then seeing in the ecosystem stakeholders with other people is this controversy of, do NGOs actually, are we supposed to run these programs, or are people that are more experienced in the startup ecosystem as in academic institutions are supposed to be running these? And so it's a really great debate to have, because this is a great opportunity for that collaboration with NGOs, with the government, and with private sector organizations that have been running these types of programs. So I think at the end of the day that these programs really do create some sort of value, whether it's the network on ground or whether it's the support that they're getting, particularly around upping their financial acumen, because I think that is in terms of training for talent. People like to say training, but I think it's kind of funny, you can't train entrepreneurs, but we say training because that's teaching them basic skill set that they can use for their startup, or they could also use it if they're not putting it into a startup, they could actually go out in the workplace. You know, there's a lot of university students participating in these programs. So it's not just necessarily about the programs, but what they take away from it. It's not always the output, is that there has to be startups that come out from these programs. There's always different measurements of results depending on the stage, depending on the demographic that these programs are catered towards. Thank you, TJ.
Thanks very much, Cheryl, for sharing. Definitely very interesting developments. So I guess if we were to stay on with you and, based on what you shared at present, if we were to look then a little bit into the future on a post-pandemic era, if I may put it, how do you then see, incubators, accelerators, and I guess the overall startup ecosystem in Cambodia? How do you see it growing?
Yeah, thanks, TJ. I think, so just to give you context actually on the pandemic, maybe the reason why we've come up with so many programs in 2020 is because our cases were quite low. We sealed the border in Cambodia in 2020, and recently we just got, I would say, the outbreak in February, end of February 2021. So we actually felt what everyone was feeling before, I guess after, the whole pandemic was happening. And so something that we've experienced and we're seeing with these startups is that they've now actually helped give opportunity to some of the consumer problems that are happening during the pandemic. For example, there are a few delivery apps that came out in 2018. And so that's quite recently. And Grab just came to Cambodia in 2017. And so when we're looking at these delivery apps, when we were in lockdown, we weren't able to go outside. In some areas, it was a complete red zone. And in those red zones, they were only being able to be delivered rice with fish sauce, for example, which is a staple as Asian food. And so in terms of these delivery startups, they were able to operate, and without them, I don't think goods, or in terms of business goods and services, they weren't able to transport because it was quite restricted. And with these delivery startups working with the government, they were able to say, look, I have a piece of paper that shows that I am a delivery service, and I'm able to then deliver the goods during the pandemic. So just on that, I think we see startups making already a big impact here. In terms of opportunities after the pandemic, I think I see it in three different ways. One is in terms of education institutions that are now playing a bigger role in creating programs and creating talent as well. And there's a niche programming as well, where people may want to focus, or programs may want to focus in sectors like tourism or agricultural. And these are industries and sectors that are actually informal businesses. And so when we look at tourism, for example, they make up around, I think, 26% of Cambodia's GDP. And in the past, since the pandemic has started, over 3,000 tourism sector related MSMEs have closed down. And so when I'm thinking about what type of programs are now offered, I think people will really understand that we need to find more niche programs that are related to sectors or related to certain demographics, because there's no one size program that fits all. And I think we're seeing more and more organizations move towards that. Education institutions, on the other hand, are developing talent, especially in the technology space. So whether they're engineers, whether they're developers, product developers, or UI UX designers, this is really missing in terms of, we have accelerator programs, for example, and some of the feedback I've gotten is that you get an expert that teaches the subject and tells them how to practicalize it using UX and UI, for example, but they don't have a specialist on their team that can then apply using that curriculum. So we're seeing sort of the gap in the tech talent here. And I think a lot of education institutions right now are trying to upskill on that or reskill on the current talent pool. And I think the biggest thing we're seeing is collaboration, which is exactly what my role is, I guess, meant to do, is essentially there's a lot of similar programming, I think, now that we're seeing, and a lot of the programs are now fighting for funding. And this funding is coming from international aid. And so when NGOs are reluctant, I think, or other programs are reluctant to share what they're doing, because they think that they're competing for this funding for the programs. But what is really interesting is that we all know there's a gap and a lack of collaboration between ESOs. And my job right now is really interesting because I'm trying to pull in people and say, look, it's actually best practice sharing, so that we can actually find what our niches are in the ecosystem and be able to play that into our advantage if you are looking for funding or partnerships. So I think on top of that, we're finding more regional interests that want to start programs or are a little bit more interested in Cambodia because, you know, the young demographics is growing. It's a majority of the population. And we'll see many of these young entrepreneurs that have gone through this programming after a couple of years, and they'll be looked up as mentors because right now we don't have many experienced entrepreneurs who have exited their companies or have raised Series A or further. So I think as time goes on, these youth will be upskilled and also more experienced in building startups that they can then mentor younger entrepreneurs in this field.
Thanks so much, Cheryl, for sharing. I think there's a common thread amongst all the speakers for this first round, really, where we talk about the need for skills development, where there's upskilling, where there's reskilling, and also this part on partnership and collaboration. I think it's really very much needed. as we continue to build the ecosystems. And on this note, I want to move back to Xia Hui, because earlier you were sharing about the center being involved in linking up, being involved in collaborations, as well as looking at how do you skill your graduates, and the potentials. So how do you see this, the linkages evolving between New Zealand and ASEAN? And I guess what can we expect, in a post-pandemic recovery phase? Shall we?
Thanks, DJ. So I got probably a few bullet points, but I don't know whether they are necessarily connected. So just bear with me. I'll be like shooting a bit of darts everywhere. So now, the way I see it, right, is that if you look back to our conversations, broadly speaking, in this area, and some of you are from the university system, right? So when we do research about innovation, we don't necessarily mention the word entrepreneurship. And then some of us will do entrepreneurship, but nothing to do with innovation, right? And that's quite common. If you look around the world when it comes to publication in innovation journals, they are different from the entrepreneurship journals. Okay, and that's because of the way we promote it as if they are actually two distinct areas. Although I must say that, in some cases, I think entrepreneurship can be tied to, just being entrepreneurial in a sort of in a service gap rather than innovation. So entrepreneurship doesn't rely on necessarily a very strong innovation. So I can see why the literature may have confounded the problem of understanding between entrepreneurship and innovation by treating them as if they are separate things. Now, then it's the same way we will confound individual entrepreneurs versus the small, medium enterprises as well. So that's how we get confused between we are talking about entrepreneurs or small, medium enterprises, or at least the sort of the small enterprises. So okay, let me put a setting right there, right? So then when it comes to the kind of linkages that we talk about, entrepreneurship and innovation between New Zealand and ASEAN. So last year, before actually COVID runs us all into Zoom, so I was in Jakarta. Of course, I was in ERIA as well, visiting Julia, and thanks for hosting us again, Julia. So I had a bunch of students from New Zealand's 7 universities, right? So because my center is a national center, so I must love every university student. So I cannot just love my university student, and then I could get into a big kind of political problems right there between the universities. And also, just out of interest only, let me give you 2 seconds there. I was told that my business card cannot have like back-to-back, like, I got one business card that shows Victoria University, but I got a separate business card that shows my center directorship. So they are separate cards. I cannot have one card that has got 2 faces because of political reasons as well. So I brought those students there, but I also find that when they actually go there, they have a lot of good ideas because we select those students based on entrepreneurial ideas, and some of them have their own companies. One of them from Otago University has already got 2 startups right here in New Zealand. But when they all go there into those ASEAN markets like Jakarta, KL, and Singapore that we went there, the kind of scale, right? That means the scale and the kind of skills, right? The digital, especially the digital side of skills, are quite remarkably different, right? So the students, when they go there, is almost like an eye-opener. It's like, what, if we were to try to create something from here, there's no way we are going to be able to, sort of link it to those ASEAN markets, because that's not what they are doing there. Right, and I think part of the challenge is the way we sort of innovate. Sometimes a lot of innovators and entrepreneurs doesn't think, especially a lot of them actually right here in New Zealand. I'll say a bit more about that later on, around the fact that we innovate because we like some things, not because we actually like it to sell to some markets. Right, so some innovations are not necessarily prepared for market. Right, again, some entrepreneurship are not well versed in dealing with how the market might conceived, right, as to those products and services. So I can see that there's a lot of misconnect between New Zealand and ASEAN right there. But of course, all is not lost, right? That's why I create some of these programs to which we have industry partnerships. So just to give you a quick example as well, 2 weeks ago, I was sort of traveling around the equivalent, not the equivalent of Jakarta, KL and Singapore, but we couldn't be there. So we actually decided that we will go to South Island, Nelson and Christchurch to do a replica of the Southeast Asia trip. Right, so what we did was the same concept again. So we went to a lot of these food-related industries, right? Food and nutrition-related industry, because the scope there is talking about the food space in Singapore, right? So there was a focus in Singapore, more concentration around there, but also broadly looking into the ASEAN region as to what kind of New Zealand products or services around the food space, not just, like fruits or whatever. We're talking about plant food, plant-based food, food, very high nutrition kind of level of supplements and all sorts of things. So we visit a lot of these companies and we actually have a lot of these master students who are from Master of Food Technology, and some of them join us, right? So we have only about 5 university students who join me, about 15 of them join me to travel around to Nelson and Christchurch. And again, we have a lot of Zoom speakers coming out from the ASEAN region, like for example, the A staff from Singapore and so on and so forth. And we also have the New Zealand Trade Commissioners and HICOM that are based in Singapore, George Street, and they Zoom in as well. Now, we also have the equivalent of the Singapore High Commissioner in Wellington, Sudesh Mania, speaks to a student as well. So that's the kind of things that I can see them getting closer to each other, as in, how New Zealand and ASEAN connectivity can get closer and closer when it comes to, being sort of entrepreneurial and being also like innovate for each other, right? So you don't just innovate out of the blue and hope that somebody is going to pick it up and you become a billionaire overnight, but actually innovate in a sense for the market as well. Now, in terms of moving forward, right, in post-pandemic, I can only say that the landscape becomes more vicious, right? As in, there are more people who doesn't really have a lot of places to run around. So as a result of that, we all sit there and dream things, I'm not saying that we are going cuckoo, but I'm saying that, we are starting to dream of different, products to make and different opportunities that we can identify, right? So a lot more vicious innovation and entrepreneurship around, in particular, the digital aspects of things, I must say, right? Even online selling and Uber and all these other things that will come through as a result of that. Logistics as well, right? The e-logistics market that is going around the world. So it'll be more vicious, but it's also, unfortunately, more of the opportunistic entrepreneurship, right? So in other words, a lot of entrepreneurship is just to exploit a certain gap and quickly get a lot of money, but doesn't have to sustain because it doesn't matter, right? So for some of them, they just create for that kind of reason. Now, in order to be able to sort of make the relationship and the ties stronger over time, right? So I do this thing that I, and Cheryl said that we are established. I'm not too sure that the SEACAP is well established yet. We only sort of a startup for 2-3 years, but I've very sort of journey-fied people or journey-fied organizations. Now, what do I mean by that? Just bear with me very quickly, right? So for example, those students who traveled with me about 2-3 weeks ago, so they went through a program which is the tertiary market immersion program. Unfortunately, we were immersed in New Zealand, but trying to link it to Southeast Asia, of course. Now, then last week they were in a session, right? So it's a journey, right? I try to put them into multiple points of engagement so that they are actually connected to the industry people as well as connected to other entrepreneurs, right? So that they can switch a lot of entrepreneurship minds. And because of the way I engage with the stakeholders, a lot of them are from Southeast Asia, right? So it exposed a lot of those students into the Southeast Asia region and the opportunities that comes out from it. So last week they were at this New Zealand Institute of International Affairs conference, to which the keynote speaker was none other than the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, right? Who, of course, did a political speech around Indo-Pacific, right? Which is around the sort of the importance of ASEAN to New Zealand in that particular speech. Now, and then earlier today, 3 of them or 4 of them actually joined me at the session that we had around the digital and creative industries, the opportunities for ASEAN, where we have the 2 business speakers, as I mentioned earlier on. So I'm trying to sort of like making the connectivity a lot more tighter by sending some individuals, but also some businesses. This is just an example of a group of students, but we also do that for the businesses as well. So we journey-fied them through multiple contact points, multiple activities, not just events, but multiple activities and multiple connectivity, so that, you know, the kind of ties between New Zealand and ASEAN are deeper, right? And with that appreciation over time, then basically you expect them to be sort of like, you know, strengthened, and I'm sure they won't stop themselves from jumping onto the plane to Southeast Asia at some point and do the real hardcore stuff, right? Walking on the street there. When the borders are actually open. So that's how we, you know, I conceptualize how to prepare them, right, for the day when we actually all can meet properly in person. But nonetheless, the connectivity can be strengthened by all this journey that I put across there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's my long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. Thank you so much. I think it's quite relevant what you shared, in that the linkages, they also have to bring relevance to the innovation and the entrepreneurial mind, you know, as they look. I like what you shared about innovating for each other, so that we are not just in our own bubble, but we are really looking at what are the needs that are out there. So, you know, in terms of, if I may then now move back to Jane, and as we were talking about linking, we're talking about upskilling, we're talking about really bringing relevance, right? From your perspective, you know, through your experiences, for Hong Kong specifically, and perhaps a little bit on Asia, what more do you think can be done for this space, you know, for incubators, for accelerators? What more do you think can be done? Jane?
Gosh, so many things we need to do. I'm actually a massive believer that incubators and accelerators can really fundamentally help startup ecosystems. You know, for the reasons that Cheryl mentioned before, that kind of education of entrepreneurs and founders, no matter what stage of ecosystem development you're in, actually, you can always learn more. And that's what's great about, you know, something like an incubator, for example, that gives you, you know, the basics. And you know, there is a language to starting up a tech startup. You know, there's a process by which you have to, you know, get your information across, you pitch, you get this, you know, funding, you basically scale, you try to dominate the market, all this kind of thing. And it has like a certain type of language that goes with it as well. And like it or not, each one of us has, you know, plays that kind of game to a certain extent, this kind of process that's sort of established in Silicon Valley that have now filtered to pretty much all the other ecosystems around the world. So you play this game and you have to be educated. You know, it's not good enough just to have that fantastic idea, having the tech brain or even the business brain or the experience to resolve that problem. You need to be able to articulate it in a way that, you know, investors will buy into you, other people will buy into you, your customers, all of that. So the incubators are really good for that kind of basic information, in addition to providing, you know, networks and stuff. And then we're talking about the accelerators, which is the next stage developing on from that, which, you know, takes them further. Sometimes they go deeper into a specific industry vertical, and other times they go basically just a lot of like advice and mentorship and scope to actually propel them to expand in other markets. So you tend to get the more kind of like real deep industry knowledge, or you get ones that really help you scale globally to different kind of markets that suit your products. And both of these have a you know, massive roles to play in the development of an ecosystem. And also, you know, the point comes in also about publicly funded you know, accelerators versus privately funded versus universities. You know, what Brian mentioned at NUS, they've churned out some amazing companies, you know, really quite great. And, you know, we've been looking at some of these kind of companies who've also expanded into Hong Kong as well. So the universities have such a good and an important role to play in this as well, because obviously they've got the, you know, the talents that's already residing at the various locations. They've got the kind of mentors in place. You know, you've got these professors who have done these deep tech research, for example, or AI kind of information. In fact, 2 of our unicorns in Hong Kong was generated through the university route as well, you know, including SenseTime, which is one of the, I think it is the highest valued AI, pure AI unicorn in the world. It's worth something like, it was about 20 billion. I don't quite know exactly what it's worth now. So the universities have a really strong role to play in guiding their students and providing that safe environment for students to try different things and get that support. And once there is that kind of commercial application possibility, to actually really help them to scale and give them the kind of like propped up support in each of those steps to go international. So that is really important. And we need to focus more on supporting all these kind of different initiatives. Privately, you know, the private sector is fantastic at really drilling deep. We've got companies here that offer pure fintech and very specific fintech kind of accelerators. We've got ones focused on purely on logistics tech. We've got one recently launched, you know, we've got food tech, we've got drones, we've got dedicated private companies focusing on that deep industry expertise, because frankly, they've got a vested interest to really grow that area, you know, for whatever kind of strategic reason that they have. To whether that adds to their existing portfolio, helps their existing businesses, all these kind of different reasons. But that's what the private sector is really good at, just really developing those private and sector specific deep startups in that kind of space. And then of course you need to generalize ones, and that's what the government and public funded ones are good for. So in Hong Kong, we've got the Hong Kong Science and Technology Park and Cyberport, 2 big science parks that the government has allocated literally billions of dollars, and talking Hong Kong dollars, into incubation accelerator programs as well. So, you know, on a government's perspective, this is something that we need to keep pushing, because we provide, you know, you need to nurture that group of entrepreneurs. You know, anyone who's worked in that startup ecosystem for a while knows about the kind of funnel. You start with a big group of startups, you slowly, you know, it comes as time goes by, you get the ones that go down that funnel, and the ones that become, you know, that big, have the big exits tend to be a small percentage of that. So at this big, large kind of area, you need to do a lot more to try and you know, create the momentum and make sure that happens. So, you know, on the government side, certainly on the funding side, we need to support them, but we also need to support them in lots of other ways. We are constantly connecting different accelerators to important investor networks or to other kind of clusters that we think can bring value to them, because it's in our interest to actually support them. We're also like supporting the university accelerators. So for example, City University has just been just won you know, public funding to create 300 startups over 3 years. You know, to like get that kind of scale and a quality kind of startup, you do need a lot of support. And Cheryl mentioned earlier about that collaboration. That's the only way to do it. The only way for everyone to basically benefit is for them to collaborate and build a strong ecosystem, so that different kind of individuals or companies can thrive within that. So, you know, that, and we've been incredibly lucky in Hong Kong to have so many really good stakeholders involved in helping and basically, you know, paying it forward in the hope that with a stronger ecosystem that they would also benefit as well. And one of the platforms we've leveraged to try and bring all of that together on a regular basis is the Start Me Up Hong Kong Festival that we organise every year. This year it was at the end of May, and basically what it is a week of events organised by lots of different groups of people on different kind of topics related to startups, whether we're talking industry specific or functionally specific, and to try and bring these people together to amplify the noise, showcase your successes, attract overseas people to attend, and do all these kind of things, get word of mouth, PR, all of it. You know, it helps to actually generate a lot of like a momentum and you know, puts that positive news out there. And, you know, it's actually, you know, hugely effective. So I wouldn't underestimate that potentially collaborating and consolidating groups to put something strong together on things like events to actually pull all of that together. I mean, for us, for this year, we had about 40,000 people attend directly and another 250,000 views through streaming media. So the reach potentially, especially in these days of COVID and virtual kind of conferences, hugely useful. Leverage those, leverage the heck out of those, you know, and, you know, hopefully based on that, you can actually, you know, really develop something really strong and compelling and, you know, valuable for your city and you know, for your university, your country, all these kind of things, which, you know, really does help the people on the ground ultimately at the end of the day.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jane.
Sure.
You know, I want to then bring this down to the IHL level, at the educational level, and pose this same question to Brian. You know, from your perspective, what more do you think can be done, perhaps in Singapore and Southeast Asia? So, Brian, if you could share, please.
Yeah, TJ, thank you so much. And, you know, both Cheryl, Jane, and Xiaohui, actually, many of the things that you said have been very much relevant here. I started off talking very much about a very focused area in the university itself. And I know, TJ, as you had mentioned, how would an IHL look at it? Actually, I would like to respond to this question in a slightly different manner, because while we do look at what we have over here, just like in Singapore, we would be irrelevant if we are not connected to the rest of the world, or particularly ASEAN. So let me address this whole question, and I hope to leave you know, the participants with some handles and some practical points that you may be able to take away to think about, because these are some of the things that we are also experiencing and what we're trying to do here at the university itself. Let me start by saying that incubators and accelerators, as we have seen them, you know, popping up in the last 10 to 15 years, is still an important part. But I'm sure everyone would agree, our incubators have to go beyond the four walls itself. So it's not anymore just having a space that you sit inside, or an acceleration program that you run, you know, a 30-day, 100-day program or whatever, because these are very established approaches. So beyond that, what are some of the things that we want to look into? And I want to give and leave with 3 areas that I feel we might want to look at this and how the university is looking into this whole area itself. The first area is ecosystem development. As in my title, and I'm very passionate about this. Jane talked about this quite a number of times. She mentioned this, and I know Cheryl also talked about this. But basically, we can't live in a bubble of our own anymore, you know. So there's a lot of connections, and I'm glad to see that from Xiaohui, how he's using the SME market with the university and the IP and linking that up. It's not easy, I know, because our university is also doing that. But that's really building up the whole ecosystem. And what's in the ecosystem? Beyond the incubators and accelerators, we need to link up with more startups, more industry people, with the corporates themselves, with agencies, with investors, and the list goes on. So really it is, as we move into beyond the incubator and accelerator, it has to be a whole ecosystem because they work with one another in itself. So that's one area that we want to look into. The second area is really an area that I think NUS as itself is focusing quite a lot on also. It is changing the mindset. I think one of the things that we can see in this day and age, or if I can say in this modern world, the whole approach of how we see and think about challenges is so different today, okay? Our challenges are not straightforward. So one of the things that the university has done is we use this term, future ready graduate. And one of the things that is being done here is our education process is also going through a transformation. What we're doing is we're enabling students to not just have one focus discipline, but multidisciplinary approach to their education itself. Now, why is this important? Because if you look at many of the problems that entrepreneurs are resolving or trying to find solutions to, What we have, as my NUS president would define it, today's world, we are dealing with what we call wicked problems. What is wicked problem? A wicked problem, as we can tell, COVID is one of them, right? First of all, it is very undefined, right? How do you define it? You can't. Many of the problems that we face today are very undefined. Secondly, they are constantly changing. So, we're trying to solve something that it's like trying to change the tire of a car when it's moving. So that's what we are facing with today. And then finally, it challenges the norm of what we know. So we can't use what we know today to solve some of these problems. So really, we're dealing again with this wicked problem, and therefore it requires a whole mindset change of how we are looking and dealing with this. And the incubators and accelerators, or rather the whole ecosystem, needs to take this as a whole, and then, how do we then leverage upon this whole concept itself? That's my second point. The last point here is really coming back to something that Cheryl mentioned earlier. How do we connect? And maybe the word she used was collaborate. NUS is also very big in looking at the ASEAN space itself. We need to collaborate with our neighbors. How do we actually work with you? How do we learn and understand, what's around here? First and foremost, ASEAN has 675 million population. That's bigger than many of the other continents around. And we are a very fragmented market. Give you one simple example to draw on the dealing with the wicked problem, and then also in the ASEAN space itself. We have a startup that's trying to resolve this whole area of rice. Rice is something that all of us in ASEAN eat, Every country that in ASEAN takes rice. Do you think the Western world will solve the problem of rice? Rice is something that only we will understand. And one of the problems that this startup is trying to solve is rice is great for a staple, but it has very high glucosamine index. So how can we reduce this? Then we've of course found a formula in mixing it with rice so that your GI does not jump after eating this compound food itself, or something that's mixed into the compound food itself. So anyway, the company is called Alchemy Food Tech. But what I'm trying to get at is this is really trying to solve a problem that only the ASEAN people will understand. No other continent will understand it, because we eat rice almost every day, right? So really this whole thing in summary is, how do we then collaborate, understand this whole environment, and then collaborate with one another? And I think we're going to see more and more of that, because here in Singapore, the same thing. Our startups may have the technology, but we do not have the market. So we need to collaborate with people around. And with that, I kind of put that summary to how we see incubators and accelerators, and how it would be for Singapore and the ASEAN space itself. TJ, thank you
so much. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you so much to our speakers. I will now hand this time over to my co-host Lena, who will just run us through, the Q&A segment. Lena, over to you.
Yes, thank you, TJ, and thank you for a very insightful and inspiring discussions to all of our speakers. I saw a very active chat box. So in this short timing period, where we want to hear the final answer from all of our speakers, maybe the best question that should be addressed is, what would be your advice for the students to focus on what product or market in order for them to possibly create an innovations for their startup labs? Because Brian has answered the last questions, maybe the first floor will be given to Cheryl. Do you want to answer this? Over to you, Cheryl.
Yeah, sure. So is the question, where should they be focusing their efforts on? And is it product market fit or?
Yes, okay. That's the questions.
Yeah, I think here in Cambodia, where I've seen a lot of younger entrepreneurs, again, the whole thing about they're so passionate about, seeing what's around them, and they're very creative of trying to solve problems. But sometimes they think that the problem is for everybody. And so what we're seeing more and more is a focus on actually understanding and doing more of the customer research rather than saying, yeah, my product is for everybody in Cambodia. So I think it's really understanding. My advice to younger entrepreneurs is to really do your research on the customer and understand their personas, talk to as many, I think everyone always knows this, talk to as many different customers in that segment that you're trying to see in terms of not just the problem that you're trying to solve, but what are the problems that they go through day to day as well, so that you're hitting their pain points and understanding that.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. So the first key point is do the research first. And I saw Jane is smiling. Maybe Jane wants to answer the second floor.
Sure.
Over to you, Jane.
Yeah, no, I would say to any entrepreneurs, actually, whatever age they're at, to actually try and resolve problems that they're familiar with. Look at the areas that they are involved in on a day-to-day basis. What kind of issues are they seeing there? Chances are, if they're seeing problems, a lot of their classmates are seeing those similar kind of problems, and if you amplify that across the kind of student body, maybe a lot more people are doing that. But how do you actually come up with a good solution? Like, for example, one of the university students in Hong Kong was tutoring, basically, to try and find extra kind of money during his university years, and find out he was getting more and more people interested to ask him to tutor. And of course, he's one person and he's got his studies. How do you basically scale that? So he basically talked to a few of these people and said, look, what is the problem that you're having? These people are asking him to tutor. Is it across the board? Are you having problems across the board with this particular subject? Is it specific kind of things? And it turned out that a lot of the kind of things was more on specific areas and certain curriculum that they were having problems with, rather than across the board, I don't know anything about quadratic equations. It was more this particular part of quadratic equations I didn't quite understand. And, this particular, I learned this in class, but I didn't know, on my homework, how I basically applied that to what I learned to actually resolving that particular problem there. So he started seeing that kind of pattern quite regularly. So he started creating this app that actually connected, that basically had a whole bunch of tutors there that quickly answered questions, and they got paid based on how quickly they answered those kind of questions. And before he knew it, he has he was still a university student when this was all happening. I think it was in his last year by the time it really kind of scaled, and now he's still got this company, and he's got like literally tens of thousands of tutors. Parents and kids pay a kind of monthly fee for the number of questions that get answered, and the tutors who actually get paid are the ones that actually answer those correctly in a fast way. So literally you can have a question with your homework and get that answered literally within, I think their average is about 2 to 3 minutes, which is actually pretty good when you're talking about really scale kind of tutors. That was the other thing. He basically vetted the tutors as well. They had to be really up to a certain kind of level. It's not your average Joe. So, that just basically shows you that, you basically encounter things everyday life that you can potentially resolve. And I think especially students, that the kind of students I've engaged with, whether we're talking at school or university, I tell you, super bright. And I think sometimes even at a younger age group, especially, they're not constrained by what you're supposed to do and what not supposed to do. They just apply kind of solutions. Well, why can't we do this? Why can't we do that? And I say, well, actually, why can't we? You can make this happen. You can resolve it this way. And I think it's, it's just encouraging that kind of like creative kind of mindset to try different things. And the great thing about students is that you're in a safe environment. You're not going to, you don't have this big, massive failure hanging over your head. Lots of people in Asia just don't want to fail or don't want to be seen to fail and things. So great time to do that. Try different things and just be open. Even, and this is told to the mentor now, to the lecturers, be open to the kids, coming up with these off the wall kind of solutions. You can sort of make that work sometimes.
Okay, thank you, Jen. Very inspiring especially for the youth. Because so be mindful with the existing problems to implement the solutions toward your business. Maybe that's the key point that should be addressed. So next, I'll give you the floor to Sia. Yeah, over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. So I want to address some of the things that I've identified in the chat room, but then I think, as Cheryl has correctly pointed out, we can't really train entrepreneurs. So, I mean, especially the university system, right? I mean, Brian, you would know quite well as well. So how we train students, right? We train students so that students ask us, how do I get these things done so I can get an A grade for your course, right? So that kind of thing is actually counterproductive to entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship means that there's no boundaries. But of course, you don't tell your student there's no boundaries, then they will give you a crappy work and expect you to give them an A grade, right? So again, the sort of the education system is actually sort of opposite directions. Is a compliance model to entrepreneurship as well. And just another quick one, right? So last week when we were there, the 15, 16 students who were there, so they now go off with 4 academic supervisors from a couple of universities. And those guys 16 of them will form themselves already form them into 4 teams of 4. And they will do projects around, things, as I give them some ideas about food security in Southeast Asia, food sustainability, and sort of a high value add food in that space. Some of the students came back with these very strange ideas, selling seaweed to Singaporeans, and others will come, and the same team will go back and say, hey, I think we can sell more mushrooms to Singapore. Right. And of course, you know why they think like that, right? It's because the national system already tells them that, New Zealand is known for agriculture, tourism, education. So people are actually sort of restricted in their mind about, we do this within these boundaries. Right, they are not thinking beyond what we are actually normally not pitched as what is good in New Zealand. So we are strong in agri-tech, for example, in the technology, agriculture space. Again, they are also probably quite strong, New Zealand, in the digital creative space. A lot of the rings and all these other things around animation, but never so as such. But the education system puts the student into a sort of a box to which they cannot become more an entrepreneur, because their entrepreneurial things is actually restricted in the box about mushrooms and seaweeds and selling more fruits to Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. So in my programs that I run, I try to be a bit more open-minded about, guys, this is what we will do. This is the future industry that we are looking to. Self-select yourself, right? If you want to come and see what the future might be like for New Zealand and our engagement with those other countries, then join us. So we have the benefit of the access to the whole country rather than being restricted within one classroom or whatever. So at least I can pick up a lot of different ideas from across the country and group them together to move forward in that space. Thank you.
Thank you, Sia. Very interesting to know. Brian, the final floor is to you.
Yeah, Lena, thank you so much. I just want to make some very quick comments and with what Xiao Li has mentioned. You're right. The education system that we've grown up with is built with a lot of boundaries and parameters. And that's the reason why the term that we often use here in the university is in innovation and entrepreneurship is the experiential education itself. So many of the things that we do, it's really experiential. I want to end off by, answering the question that was asked about, what area should they be looking into for a startup? In many of the startups I have been involved in and seen, I think there are many problems in the world to solve, but you need to find a problem that you're passionate about, because when you try to solve that problem, when you're trying to build that startup, you're going to run into a lot of hurdles. You're going to run into a lot of naysayers. You're going to run into many problems. It is your passion in this area that you believe in, that you'll be able to build it and grow it and then make it successful. So, rather than finding somebody else's problem, find a problem that you are passionate about. And I'm sure you'll make it and be successful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. So be mindful and be open with your environment. So at the end of this webinar, I'm afraid that we are running out of time. So having said that, we would also love to hear your feedback. So our team will post the QR code at this site. Okay, you'll see it, and I have posted the post survey link at the chat box. So please feel free to fill in that information. And for those who wants to receive the e-certificate, please do so as well. So I would like to say thank you again to all of the speakers, to Sia, to Brian, to Cheryl, and to Jane. Myself is also learning throughout these discussions, and I look forward to stay in touch with you again. Over to you, TJ. Thank you all.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. It's really been a very enlightening, and also to hear, actually to hear your passion, to hear from you sharing the passion that you have in doing what you are doing. And it's been a joy to be able to moderate this with you, to have this conversation this afternoon. Julia, if you'd like to just close this session off with some closing remarks.
Thank you, TJ. Thank you to all speakers. I will try to be as brief as possible because we are very late, but what you shared was so interesting that I think we could keep going over and over, because again, it was really, really insightful. And I think we couldn't start better our second half of the series. So thank you so much once again to Brian, Cheryl, Jane, and Sia. Let me first address a couple of points that were raised in the chat box that was becoming very active. Number one, someone was asking us about a pool of mentors. Stay tuned, because we are thinking about that, and maybe you will learn more about this kind of new developments towards the end of this year. And someone was also asking about potential threats from digital technologies for innovation and the startup ecosystems. We talked extensively about that in a previous episodes in the series, the one titled Deep Tech and the Future Economy. So if you go on our YouTube channel, you will find that episode, and maybe it will provide some answers to the questions you were asking. And now to conclude, again, I think we had a very, very interesting conversation. Many of you mentioned about the innovations in your respective countries. There are a lot of indications that actually we are entering a phase of sustained innovation worldwide, spurred by the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, this is a terrible crisis, but we need new thinking, new ideas, new business models. And this is why we are seeing the number of startups worldwide going up, and also the number of VCs investments going up, not only in the ASEAN region, but worldwide. And this is why I think the conversation we're having throughout this webinar series are so interesting, given the current situation and the current time. We have also discussed about the many different types of actors that can provide incubation and accelerator services, governmental agencies, like the examples provided by Jane, universities that are fundamental actors in innovation ecosystems, and we heard from Brian and Sia, and also NGOs and international organizations like UNDP, as Cheryl shared with us, very interesting. So again, many different actors are playing this role, and this is why, to echo what probably everybody said, all of you said in the webinar, collaboration is so important. We really need to join efforts and forces, even if we are doing sometimes a slightly different job, because we know it by research and the literature. Collaboration is good for innovation, and so we should definitely keep talking with people from different countries, different points of view, different institutions, to try to see how to strengthen this innovation ecosystem throughout the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that's it from me. Once again, thank you so much to all the speakers. We will definitely stay in touch. We want to hear and engage with you again in the coming months. And thank you to all our participants for staying connected with us until the very end. And you see here the flyer for our next episodes that will be in 4 or 5 weeks' time. And you will receive information very soon. Thank you very much again. And I think now we can close this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.